Yes, Patrick Montaigne.
Good morning again, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of ICPSK, I want to take this opportunity to welcome you to this session, which is the ultimate session on the last day of our 3-day international conference. Our session is session number 8 on corporate governance value proposition, which is, I believe, the health talk on corporate governance. Our Honorable Doctor almost scared us to death, and I'm happy we were given a tea break just to confirm some of us that we are still alive. Because if you heard what is mentioned, you should have been doing for your daily life, and some of us do very little. It's good we are to take a walk just to confirm you are still alive. Ladies and gentlemen, our speaker for this session is a renowned personality. He's a colleague in the profession. He is CS Professor P.L.O. Lumumba, currently the Director and the Chief Executive Officer of Kenya School of Law. He's a Professor of Public Law and the founding Dean of Kabarak University School of Law. He has lectured law at the University of Nairobi, United States International University Africa, Wellington University USA, Nairobi Summer School. Professor P.L.O. Lumumba is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya and Tanzania. He is a holder of Bachelor of Laws and Master of Laws degrees from the University of Nairobi and an LLB for the University of Ghent, Belgium. He is a certified public secretary and a member of the Kenya Institute of Management. Professor P.L.O. Lumumba has been trained on human rights at the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies, University of London, England, and at the Wallenberg Institute of the University of Lund in Sweden, and on international humanitarian law in Geneva, Switzerland. He is a renowned legal practitioner. He is a former secretary of the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission and the former director of the Preferred Kenya Anti-Corruption Commission. Professor P.L.O. Lumumba is also a founder of P.L.O. Lumumba Foundation, which is a philanthropy organization, founding trustee of the African Institute for Leaders and Leadership, and the founding chairman of the Association of the Citizens Against Corruption. Professor P.L.O. Lumumba was organized by the Kenya USA Association for the Martin Luther King Jr. Leadership Award in 1996, and was a recipient of the 2008 Martin Luther King Africa Salute to Greatness Award by the Martin Luther King Jr. Africa Foundation. He has also been included in the Who is Who in the world and is a distinguished Mwalimu Nyerere Lecturer for 2014. Do I continue? With those few, I take this opportunity to welcome Professor P.L.O. Lumumba to address us.
Thank you very much for the elaborate introduction. I've prepared a fairly long paper which will be distributed to you. I'll not read the paper. So I'll speak very briefly. The paper speaks in great detail of what I consider to be the subject. I'll not do a PowerPoint presentation. I want to have eye contact with everybody. And I want to preface my presentation by making reference to this daily Kenyan business, and I'll explain why I'm doing so. At the back of the page, you'll find a quotation attributed to Pablo Picasso. Everything you can imagine is real. When you go to page 12, you'll find a variety of quotations. One of them is, "We are all proud of it," and Chad Bosman is incredible. He is attributed to the rock singer Mick Jagger. The next quotation is, "When we needed it, he gave it to us from his soul. Get on up and honor James Brown." Is attributed to the rapper MC Hammer. The next one is, "Watching Get On Up Right Now in Tears, Thank You Godfather," attributed to CeeLo Green. And then Bosman deserves a Pulitzer, a Nobel, an instant election to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Time magazine. This is a Kenyan paper. And you will note that the references is, in fact, the person to whom tribute is paid is an African American. You'll also note that no African is thought to be worthy of being quoted. There is a sense in which that defines Africa today, even in matters as mundane as governance. I have in the last few years taken time to try to understand the plight of Africa. This is not in my paper, but it will speak to the contents thereof, which speak for themselves. The African economy today is no more than 1.2 trillion in its GDP. The Brazilian economy is about 1.2 trillion GDP. Brazil has no more than 150 million, give or take, the population. The African population is about 1 billion. Some countries have not had a census for the last many years, give or take. Russia, with a population of less than 100 million, has a GDP of 1.2 trillion. Many of the large companies in Africa are to be found in Southern Africa. And it's not lost on me that MTN is a South African company. The gross turnover for Walmart supermarket in the United States last year was 450 billion Kenya shillings. The Kenyan GDP was about 38 billion. There are people from the central bank. The entire East African economy is no more than 150 billion. We are Mickey Mouse arrangements. Today, if you look at many African countries, the indices and the standardizations are Eurocentric or Americocentric. There is nothing that defines Africa in the real sense. Even this institution is happiest when it links itself to the United Kingdom, so that the chairman will be very proud. I'm not saying that this is what he says. If he is certified by the Commonwealth equivalent, then you think we are very great. Many of the companies that are represented here, if you work for Barclays Bank of Kenya, matters relating to governance will actually be determined in England. And if they want to cascade it down, they take it to South Africa, and then it rises up in Africa. In other words, the African manager is nothing but an automaton. who is not allowed to think. That is the reality. He simply implements. That is true of the Standard Group of companies. That is true of Kenya Breweries, which is owned largely by Guinness. That is true of British American Tobacco. That is true of many companies. Even our Kenya Bureau of Standards may pretend to be a standardization organization, but it has no capacity to give the standards that it purports to give. So that in truth, they have millions of stamps which they sell and which you find affixed even on our water bottles. But I can tell you that those items which have the KEBS standardization mark, whether diamond or otherwise, have not been tested in the real sense. So that the standardization body is merely a revenue collection body. That speaks to the question of governance in Africa. And when therefore my good friend Paul Wangai, doctor, speaks about the wellness of the body, we who are in organizations which we serve as company secretaries must talk about the wellness of our companies. Many times in organizations and meetings such as these, we of the Negroid race are satisfied when we make reference to studies that are undertaken in Harvard, so that outside as you came in, and I respect John Maxwell, all the books written about leadership are by John Maxwell, including the Bible and its leadership perspectives. It is not lost on me that John Maxwell is an Anglo-Saxon, and that his worldview is defined in that way. It is not lost on me that many of us will refer to recent studies conducted by the Harvard University. And if you watch very keenly when Dr. Wangai was making a presentation on the 1.2 million studies that were carried out on cancer, they carried out studies in every continent except Africa. There was no study conducted in Africa at all, if you watch very keenly. And many times, even when you look at the CNN keenly, when they talk about the world weather, sometimes Africa is excluded, except the climate and the temperatures in Johannesburg and Cairo. In other words, Africa above the Limpopo and below the Sahara does not exist in the minds of many people. Let me now situate that in respect of the subject of governance, and why I submit that until Africa changes, Africa is going nowhere. I can confirm it. We may have these Mickey Mouse arrangements, and we'll survive until the second coming of Christ. But our impact on world economy and on world business will be a dot which cannot be seen and which can be ignored. Africa contributes no more than 4% in international trade. Africa does not trade with itself more than 20%. Africa is in dire straits. And when we talk about governance, one can actually say that we are back to the past. If you go to former French colonies in Africa today, I'm still alive to my subject of governance. If you go to Cote d'Ivoire, you go to Senegal, you go to Niger, you go to Central African Republic, you go to the former French colonies, the attitude of the Paris government is that they are now being dealt with in the manner that they were dealt with during the colonial period. And in their Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they are reintroducing the institutions that dealt with them, including the foreign legionnaire. In other words, the issues of governance and standardization in former French colonies are determined by Paris. If you come to Kenya today, there are many attempts, and Kenya is one of the better African countries. And Kenya is one of the few countries that has a few homegrown initiatives. When you look at the complexion of the Kenyan economy and the laws that relate to issues of governance, whether you look at the Companies Act, which I'm aware is undergoing revision, you know that our Companies Act is the 1948 Companies Act of England. You know that even the Companies Act that we are revising is actually looking at some of the committees and some of the commissions that took place in England to inform Africa and Kenyan company law so that we have change without change. You know that our Limited Partnerships Act, which is now a Limited Partnerships Act, has borrowed largely from the English Partnership Act. You know that our Partnership Act has borrowed heavily from the English Partnership Act, which has borrowed from the European directives on standardization of business organizations in Europe as prescribed by the OECD. So that typically if you ask a CES in Kenya or anywhere in Africa to define for you what is governance, they'll tell you the OECD now defines governance as the direction and control. They'll tell you that the Commonwealth Secretariat now defines governance and control and direction. And they'll tell you that you cannot talk about governance until you talk about the Cadbury Principles of 1992, after the commission led by Lord Cadbury, and that these principles are the Cadbury Principles. In other words, you could very well read an English textbook and say you have talked about governance. That is how original we are in this part of the world. And I'm telling you that if we continue in that direction, our universities continue to give sterile education. If you go to many of the MBA degrees that are now being offered like confetti around the country, there is no substance to most of them. Most of them have picked bastardized versions of instruction from Harvard in the name of case studies. And they'll study Enron, they'll study Merrill Lynch, but they'll not study Nyaga brokers. They'll not study Uchumi, they'll not study CMC. In other words, in terms of the environment, there is like fish out of water. And therefore, I want us to interrogate the question of governance, first by recognizing that we are out of our depth, because a standard definition of governance is as prescribed to us by the OECD. And number two is the Cadbury's Principles, which you all know. And you are also alive of the Commonwealth prescription and the Harvard University prescription on what is governance, and Brown University. Those are the definitions that we'll give, and the most recent is the Barcelona School of Business, which now gives us what governance is. Nothing new. Direction and control with a view to ensuring sustainability of the institution. That is what governance is in a single sentence. But the question is, when we talk about the health of the company, is there something that is Afrocentric that can be defined as informing governance? One may, in fact, say that the entire institution of the company is alien to the African way of doing business. And that for that reason, you cannot have something that is Afrocentric. One may also say that there is a sense in which there is globalization, and that therefore you cannot talk about a Kenya-centric, Afrocentric way of doing business, and that one would be romanticizing too much, if you may, if one were to talk about a Kenyan-specific governance model. But the truth is that there is a sense in which other parts of the world have now recognized that you can borrow from best practices and use those best practices to address the unique circumstances of your own country. Africa does not do that. And that is our Achilles heel, if you may. We borrow foreign ideas, lock, stock, and barrel. And for that reason, they don't survive as they should. We all know that governance requires that issues of management must be conducted in a manner that is open, that is transparent, that is ethical. I'm not going to rehash them. I'll be teaching grandmothers how to suffer. I don't intend to do that. You are practitioners, and therefore I'm not going to rehash that. You know what it is that the ingredients of governance are, and therefore it would be an insult to you to reproduce them. Let me speak to the things that depart from the known path. If that therefore is governance, typically governance will have a distinction between owners and the managers. And we now have how you deal with owners. Sometimes we call them the stakeholders. And in this regard, you must have a dichotomy between the public company and the private company, family-owned companies, and all those things that we are familiar with. But the rule of the thumb, the constant note in every organization is that you must have good governance structures which allow for the sustainability of the company and dealing with issues of the bottom line. Traditionally, we knew that the bottom line was defined by the profit and loss accounts, and that therefore the health of a company was determined by how healthy the financial books are. But other civilizations have now recognized that that is only an aspect of the equation, an important one, we admit, but that is not the entire equation. And I invite you who are practitioners, to look at the business models that we now see in different parts of Europe. It is not lost on me that the question of governance is one that has been given quite some prominence. When you look at the OECD now, and you look at the activities of the European Union from the Brussels government, and you look at the directives that issue to the 27 odd members of the EU, you'll discover that there is a movement towards uniformization of entire Europe in terms of governance issues for the sake of ease of movement and ease of goods and movement of labor. But there are few countries which have refused to be uniformized in that way. And that is why I think that there is a sense and wisdom in looking at how the Scandinavian countries of Norway, or Sweden, Finland, and Denmark have operated, even if they are not dyed-in-the-wool members of the European Union, in terms of issues of governance. And they have put premium on the critical issues of transparency and accountability. They have put premium on issues of ethics. They have put premium on issues of the vertical as opposed, or rather the flat management style, so that we don't have the major domo kind of organizations which we used to have, having inherited from the United Kingdom, where you have a demigod in the form of a managing director with an office as large as this one, and everybody else in small offices. It's now recognized that those modes of governance are actually primitive. But Africa has excelled in primitivity, modernized primitivity in the area of governance. And let me now give a few examples, if only to demonstrate. Because there is a sense in which the entire question of governance depends on resources. In Kiswahili tunasema rasilimali watu na rasilimali fedha. The most important resource is the person. How do you deal with the person in the entire arena of governance? In typical African societies, and this is very common, particularly if you look at governance in African governments, the African governor is a very strange being. Because the African governor, because he governs the government, therefore governance is relevant there. The African governance actually is a victim of low self-esteem. And low self-esteem manifests itself through the manner in which they deal with it. He needs a big office to deal with his ego. Even when he does it, he needs a big desk on which there is no paper at all. He needs 2 secretaries secretaries who are idle most of the time. He needs 6 telephones, which are trophies, which he refers when visitors visit his office. He has 5 cars, which he doesn't use, but they are necessary in a conversation. That is the typical African government. And you are familiar with it. And I was quite intrigued when I talk about governance. 3 days ago, the Pope of the Catholic Church was in Seoul, South Korea. And he was being accompanied to the dais by the President of South Korea. What is amazing, there was no bodyguard. The Pope and the lady walked to the podium, and there were 2 chairs, and the President pulled the chair for the Pope. If it was in Africa, the dais would have cost 10 million, completed the toilet, which they not use. So sometimes you cannot understand the psychology of the poor man. He does things that are completely inexplicable. That is in the government side. In African companies, you also used to have that. I'm still talking about governance in companies. Look at your typical old companies that we inherited from the United Kingdom, and many of them collapsed. I just want to give you a few examples. The city council, when I grew up in Nairobi, garbage was collected on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Saturdays, and commentators used to say that garbage collection in Nairobi was as regular as a religious ritual. Today, you don't have that. They collect more money. What was the problem? The Nairobi City Council, which is now inherited by the county government, does not run an efficient water system, does not run a garbage collection system. We used to drink water from the taps. Today, if you drink water from the taps, you are suicidal. What happened? These are issues of governance that have come about, but they now do things, they have more money, but they can't do it. The telecoms. We used to have landlines. I do not know how many of you still have landlines. I don't have any. They worked themselves out of business. Poor governance and accountability. Telecom worked itself out of business. The Kenya Power and Lighting is working itself out of business. Its only salvation is that it is a monopoly. So you can see that these institutions have collapsed. The insurance companies. We had the motor pool, we had the Kenya National Assurance, we had Lakestar Insurance, we had Stadium Insurance, we had United Insurance. All these collapsed. They were managed by African, the Negroid. What happened? Because issues of governance, issues of ethics were not given their pride of place. Today, when we talk about governance, we must be asking ourselves, when we talk about control and direction, what do we need? Let us look at the Kenyan complexion to just tell you the so-called successful companies, and I'll exclude equity in this regard because it's a latter day Johnny come lately into the arena. I want to look at the tradition of companies that you and me have, and look at who is at the helm. When you find a locally managed company, the reason why it survives is because there is an element of a foreign model of governance. Kenya Airways was a collapsing entity. And I can confirm to you, if KLM want to withdraw, within 10 years you will not have Kenya Airways. Because the governance structures and standardizations come from the Netherlands. When they are hiring a chief executive, the Dutch will have a say. I remember the dark ages, when if you booked Kenya Airways and you are flying to Kisumu, the first 10 seats were collapsed. Because a cabinet minister or a cabinet secretary and everybody who was in government considered himself very important. So you lost 10 seats because of issues of governance. The question of the commercial angle disappeared. When the Dutch came, it changed. It now became a commercial enterprise. And look at airlines across Africa, those which have not been allowed to operate on commercial principles. They all collapsed. Therefore, when we talk about the environment, what is it that we are talking about? When we talk about governance, what is it that we are talking about? What is the litmus test? I'll finish in the next 10 minutes. Are very relevant in our discussions of the question of governance. You as company secretaries, you attend board meetings. What do? Are you a glorified stenographer whose only role is to take minutes without meaningful contribution? What is the traditional real role of a company secretary? What should you do in order to inform management? Remember, there is a distinction between management and ownership. The long-term health and sustainability of the company is the duty of the board to give direction in matters of leadership. To ensure that the cogs operate properly, you have the management team who may not have the long-term view, but have a situational interest in the success of the company as directed by the board. What are the ingredients that you need? We have already talked about accountability. We have already talked about transparency. In public companies, which some of you belong to, you know that there is something called the procurement bill. You know, the procurement bill was a product of the World Bank. I remember the World Bank when they made prescriptions, one size fits all. And the procurement laws across Africa were made on the assumption that Africans are thieves. That was the underlying philosophy, and that because they are thieves, you must have systems that will ensure that they don't steal. What they did not know is that these thieves knew how to circumnavigate the law. Today, therefore, what is happening is that the procurement laws that we have them have legitimized what I call theft in accordance with the law. What is theft in accordance with the law? Theft in accordance with the law is that the act tells you that you need 3 quotations. You'll get 3 quotations. You'll get a low quotation out of them. So that, and somebody was, this is a real example in government. 2 days ago, a head of a government institution whom I will not name told me they were traveling to Burundi. He went to Kenya Airways, he was told the ticket to Burundi was 29,000. He made an order for the tickets to be issued. The procurement department said, you are now taking over our work as a procurement unit. He went to the permanent secretary, and the permanent secretary said, you allow the procurement people to do their work. They got a ticket for 139,000 Kenya shillings, the lowest bid. The real value is 29,000. They got it for 139. Talk of transparency and accountability. The Norwegians now say that Africans have amazed the world. They are capable of accounting without being accountable. And what is the difference? In other words, if you require receipts, I'll give you. But it doesn't deal with the question of value for money. So if you look at the health of the company, what kills companies is lack of accountability. And let us have a few examples, if only to illustrate our point. We have seen how books are cooked, and this is not a unique African problem. We are familiar with what happened with Merrill Lynch. We are familiar with what is now studied at most universities of Enron, and how they succeeded in confusing people for a long time. We are familiar with this Jewish man who was receiving money for pensions. What was his name? I've forgotten him. Maddox. So there is no shortage of examples in Europe and America. The only difference with Europe and America is that they do something about it. Not that we don't do something about it, we also do something about it. We have seen the case of CMC in this country where there was insider trading and all these other things. In a typical country where people follow the law, the individuals in CMC who are the authors of what happened in CMC would be in prison. But in this country, they are not likely to be in prison. What will happen, actually, they are likely to be elected into government. And why do I say that half in jest and half in seriousness?
If you elect such an individual in parliament, it's like electing a hyena to prepare the best laws for the safety of goats. And you and me know that that will not happen. We also have the Nyaga stockbrokers, which you are familiar with. These institutions were institutions which were being audited every year, and there is this thing that annoys me in every audit report. We have had we have examined the books in accordance with international standards, and we are satisfied that that typical thing that you could give a parrot to read. And we read it at every annual general meeting in companies, and it was read at CMC, it was read at Nyaga stockbrokers, and they all collapsed. We also have the Uchumi. You and me know that Uchumi was created in 1976 to give access to poor people for high quality goods at affordable rates. Individuals simply raided Uchumi, and Uchumi nearly collapsed but for the government's intervention, which I think was a good thing. In other words, if you allow certain conscious decisions to be made, you will discover that issues of governance are issues that are designed to inform the manner in which we conduct our affairs. Let me now begin to move to the last phase of my 5 minutes in the following ways. Number one, governance must be seen at a very broad level. I refuse to be a prisoner of narrow definitions of governance. I hold the view that governance must start with the government, because it is the government that creates an overall political environment that allows for business to thrive. And you've seen this in the recent past, if you permit me to see countries that have moved from the lower class to the middle class, such as Brazil and Chile. You've seen this in countries such as Korea. You've seen this in countries such as Thailand. You've seen this in countries such as Indonesia, the so-called Asian tigers. You've seen this in the Arab world, in countries such as the Emirates, Qatar, Abu Dhabi, and Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, the Arab countries, and how they have created a political, perhaps not political, but an economic environment that allows for governance systems which are sustainable and which inform the realities and address the interests of the people. So a good government, good laws, good policies, enabling environments are critical to the creation of an environment that will inform how countries perform. Just this morning I was watching the comparative study of having goods pass through Mombasa and goods passing through Dar es Salaam. We are losing business to Dar es Salaam. Moving goods from Mombasa, a container from Mombasa to Kigali, from Mombasa to Kigali, 450,000. From Dar es Salaam, 355,000, 460,000. Where do you do business? Dar es Salaam. In other words, in our quest to tax people, we are creating an environment that is actually hostile to the conduct of business. The licensing regimes. What are we doing with the licensing regime? Because these are aspects of governance which are not so good. In other words, I'm saying that we must liberate ourselves from the indices and prescriptions that are given to us by OECD in appreciation of the realities of our environment while being alive to the global trends. So number one, a good government, good laws, good rules and regulations, good human beings. There is this assumption, you hear people say that we now have CCTVs in Nairobi and Mombasa, therefore theft will go down. Who tells you? The thieves now know that they are CCTVs. The first thing they'll do is to disable or destroy them. Or because CCTVs don't have night vision, they will make sure that they don't steal in a manner that they will be recorded. They'll have masks. The last time I checked, CCTVs don't unmask people. There is this assumption, and they are very pedestrian arguments, which I hear somebody saying, I'm standing on a podium, saying now we have solved the problem because of CCTVs. Good human beings. In other words, ethical human beings. And ethics is at the very heart ethics and integrity, and I refuse to believe that people who are paid well in and of itself solve the problem. It is wrong. In fact, when you give people more money, sometimes they say if they are policemen, sasa tunalipwa vizuri ukitaka kutuonga tuonge sawasawa. So there must be a sense in which you recognize that money is a useful compensation, but you also create other systems. How do you deal with the cost of education? How do you deal with the cost of health, the cost of holidays, the things that consume money? Good human beings. And that requires that the society is also hostile to thieves. Part of the African problem why Africa does not go very far is our high tolerance for thieves. In Africa, if you are in a government position and you don't steal, they say you are stupid. They say you are stupid. They say you eat where you are tethered. A friend of mine even told me when we were fighting corruption that in fact, how can it be that a fish can swim in water and some water does not get into its mouth? And I told him, why can't the fish close its mouth? The tragedy of the African fish is that it opens its mouth even wider. So the point I'm making is that we must be ethical. And ethics is a function of both the leadership and the followership. In fact, I know borderline people who are forced to enter into unethical behavior because of the pressure of the society. In our professions, law, company secretaries, people say, but your colleague is doing very well. What is happening with you? Are you bewitched? They even introduce your cards into the whole arena. So that is as far as the question of ethics. And then there is the question of sanctions. In government now there is a ritual called wealth declaration. It's a ritual which means nothing. Because your typical individual in government will never have property in his name or her name. Not even in the wife's name nowadays, because wives can also disappear. I know that Dr. Mongai says it's good to be a woman. I agree. Wives will disappear with your money. So what do? What they do is that they have companies where their drivers and their gardeners are directors and they don't know. Those drivers don't know. Nowadays we require you to produce your photograph. They even take those photographs, but the driver does not know. They sign with the left hand for the driver. I know Egypt now saying that you don't take your passport size photograph, they take one of you. If you go there, they take it themselves. There are methods that are being made, but I'm saying that these are issues which are critical in our dealing with the question of governance. And I'm saying, therefore, you come from government, you come to companies. Companies must have standards. And I believe that many of the companies that we have now have the thing that is called this vision, mission, and values, which are good things. They are good things because it's a constant reminder that you've got to behave in a particular way. And I want to submit to you that in fact the reason why companies survive is because there are more good people in the company. The bad people are very few, but the children of darkness are conspirators, and they never say die. The children of light never work as a team. That is why they are always overwhelmed. So you put two stones, they remove one, because they also don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden egg. So ethics in companies, governance, and all those standard contracting, all those charters are very important for governance. The environment, how do you deal with your staff? Staff motivation. These are issues of governance that I think are very important. And I hold the view, the rest of the things that I've spoken to in quite some detail. I've spent quite some intellectual energy in writing my paper. And when you read it to its full effect, you see some of the things that I've spoken to. And because I must stop, let me now just recur so that the rest can be through interaction. What was my brief? My brief was to talk about governance. My brief brief was to talk about the proposition. But I refused that invitation to be straight-jacketed into a typical presentation where I simply rehash what OECD says, what the Commonwealth says, what Cadbury says, that you know. The second issue that I spoke to is that most of the companies that we serve are governed by principles and rules that are not made in the African environment. And that there is a sense in which those rules are good. But the other truth is, as was taught to me as a law teacher, a great English law lord once said, that English law is like the English oak. It grows with great exuberance in England. But when you uproot it and transplant it into another environment and another soil, it will not grow with equal exuberance unless you prune it and tend it and water it. The tragedy is that we never do that, and our trees then wither and they give fruits that are bitter and dangerous. I'm saying that the rules are good. The third thing that I said is that Africa is going through a process of recolonization and re-globalization in the very classical sense. Remember that Africa was globalized once through slave trade. Remember that Africa was globalized once through colonization. Remember that Africa was globalized once through neo-colonization. Remember that Africa is now being re-globalized through business. The very first people to come into East Africa was Imperial British East African Company. It is business that came first, the flag followed later. And you can now begin to see those in your typical companies which are in this country. So we must begin to question, on what principles does our Capital Markets Authority work? On what principle does our National Stock Exchange work? On what principles are we standardizing our goods? In other words, when we talk about the environment and we require the NEMA license and we talk about all those things, are we responding to the realities of a community which is pre-industrial? The fifth thing that I've not talked about but I want to be sensitive to, on issues of governance. How are we as companies which are operating within the context of East Africa organizing our business in a manner that is sensitive to what is happening in Arusha by virtue of the rules and regulations that are being made in Arusha? How are we responding to the COMESA questions? We know what is happening with sugar and related products from COMESA. How are we responding to the African Union and ultimately the WTO rules? Remember that WTO rules are Eurocentric rules and Americocentric in many ways. Number 6, I'm saying that our companies must also be in a position to recognize that our companies are very small. Africa is sustained by small businesses. How are we running those small businesses? Do we have rules and regulations for them? Do we have issues of governance for them? We now have ways of fund. We have all these women's fund. We have all these funds. You are doing your big thing in Nairobi and Mombasa and Eldoret and Kisumu. But the fulcrum and the backbone of the African economy, which informs you, is in rural Kenya. What are the governance issues that we are dealing with at that level? Issue number 7, how are we dealing with the human resource, which is the most important human resource in this arrangement? How are our labor laws? Are we following the the rules by International Labour Organization? What are our laws relating to labor? These are issues that are very important in terms of ensuring that we have good laws. Number 8, what are our rules and regulations? What kind of laws are we making? We now have 47 counties and 47 governors. We are unique in this sense. We have overtaken Nigeria. Nigeria has 37 governors, Kenya has 47 governors. This is the most expensive government in Africa and in the world relative to our GDP and relative to our population. The most expensive government in the world. We don't recognize that. And therefore, when you are doing business, what are the licensing regimes? They are beginning to say that if you transit from one place to another, they'll apply levies. So that if you move from Nairobi to Malaba, they are going to apply levies. These are issues that are very critical in terms of creating a work environment. So ladies and gentlemen, if I go on and on, no wisdom will have been served. Wisdom is only served if I stop now. And I must stop now by saying that at the end of it all, I believe that this profession is an important profession, and many are the times that I think that we punch below our weight, and because we punch below our weight, our presence in the boardrooms is merely token, and we are glorified stenographers, and I believe that it's the duty of the Association of Company Secretaries, working with lawyers and other professionals, to begin to have their voice heard and to begin to move towards an East African protocol or East African standardization process on issues of governance, on issues of accountability, on issues of procurement, so that in the next 5 years we are able in many ways to issue our own East African specific regulations which are borrowed from other best practices across the world. It has been done by the Latin Americans, it has been done by the Asian tigers. If we don't do it, I can guarantee you that Africa will always be a scar on the conscience of the world. Thank you.
Should we give a hearty applause?